Welcome to game 2 of the World Championship 2021 Beyond 146 here. Today Magnus started on the white side, and as usual there was a lot of speculation as to what he will play. He started 1d4 instead of e4, and Nepo replied knight f6. He continued c4. Nepo replied e6. Already this gives us a lot of interesting information. First, that Nepo was planning to go into these QGD type structures. So after knight f3 he went d5 as opposed to g6 on move 2, which would have led into structures that you get in the Grunfeld, which is another opening that Nepo tends to play as black. So he went for e6, knight f3, d5, and here Magnus also threw a slight curveball. He played g3, going into the Catalan type structures. I mean, Magnus can play anything basically, and he has played the Catalan before, but it's not really one of his go-to. He tends to more often play the normal QGD structures with the knight f6, the knight f3, bishop f4, and try and get an advantage that way. But today I went for a Catalan. Bishop e7 was played, bishop g2, and both sides castled. Because he played a Catalan, it makes me suspect maybe he was working with Daniel Dubov. He's one of the players who plays very interesting Catalans nowadays. And as we'll see in this game, Magnus played the pawn sacrifice idea, which he's famous for. I mean, not the specific idea, but the general idea of sacrificing a pawn in the opening for counterplay. So here we're in a normal Catalan opening. Nepo takes on c4. This is all theory, of course. Queen c2 was played, and then he played b5. This was the first slightly rare move. In this position, it's been reached about 8,000 times in the database. b5 has been played only about 460 times. So slightly rare move. The more typical thing to do is to go for a6 here. With the idea of playing b5 eventually. But a6 and white goes a4, and there's a whole bunch of theory that follows from there. But the immediate b5 is not as common. But also has been played a few times. And here Magnus also decided to go throw an even curvier curveball and go for an even rarer move. Here a4 is like pretty much the only serious move that's seriously played. Bishop g5 is the second on the list, but a4 is played 462 times. Bishop g5, the second, is played only 4 times. So the rest are only 1-1-1. No one actually seriously plays them. And yet Magnus played one of them. He played 95, and which has only been played once by 2600 level players in the database that I have here. Quite rare. And yeah, this threw Nepo off a bit, and he had to he got out of book. He had to think a bit for himself. And it's an interesting move. Of course, it unleashes the bishop on the long diagonal. Very powerful. Looking at that rook, that also sacrifices pawn on d4, and in a lot of lines you can actually just sacrifice that pawn for counterplay. You should note that you are in an opening where Magnus has already sacrificed the pawn that was taken on c4. And in general, in the Catalan, you do this and you get counterplay by playing like a4 and b3. And either you get the pawn back, or you manage to tie up black's pieces so much to the defense that they become inactive, and you get a lot of powerful counterplay for giving up the pawn. So Nepo continued with c6, and this was officially the new move, the novelty. Then Magnus continued a4 with the typical idea. Nepo plays knight d5. Also a fairly typical idea. The knight just physically blocks the diagonal, and then it doesn't look all that dangerous because the bishop takes. You're not really afraid of that. And you want to sack the knight, you have to play e4. But then the pawn on e4 itself would then obstruct the bishop. So just putting the knight on d5, it's a very good technique when it comes to blunting the bishop. Magnus continued with knight c3. The knight also hits that point one more time. And he basically wants to pry open this diagonal, right, with a takes b5 and then knight takes d5, maybe an e4 in the mix. And once he can unleash the power of that bishop, he may get more than he sacrificed, which is just a pawn. And then f6, the knights drop back to f3. And here Nepo played queen d7. Also a slightly surprising move. Here in this position, white is basically threatening to win the pawn back on b5. The typical move that you need to play when it comes to positions like this is to push b4, which is what most of the commentators thought Nepo was going to go for. With the idea of gaining tempo on the knight goes somewhere, maybe to e4, and then you go something like bishop a6, and you tie down that pawn, and you try and keep the pawn, and you ask white what his compensation is. But Nepo didn't go for something this sharp. Perhaps he was afraid of walking into some prep. So he went for queen d7, which is a more neutral move. You just hold down the pawn basically. You don't really commit to any idea just yet. And your plan is to put this bishop on b7 where it's protected by the queen, and then you're not really afraid of these reveals any longer. But in these lines, it does seem a lot more difficult to hold on to the extra pawn. And Magnus pushed e4 at this point, kicking out the knight. He can take on c3, he can go to b4. Taking on c3 doesn't seem to be very good. It only strengthens White's pawn center, and White gets a lot of what he wants. With a strong center and the possibility of opening up this bishop with an e5, he's probably doing very, very well. I mean, look at all of Black's pieces here, and it's not difficult to imagine that White has more than enough counterplay for the pawn that he's invested. So after b4, the e4, the knight dropped here to b4 instead, because you notice another thing that the move e4 does is that now the square d3 is very weak, and the knight can just come and sit here. So this is the idea, to just come in here and sit on d3, and those two moves were played. So knight b4, the queen came to e2, then the knight plumped in on d3. And now it's starting to look very interesting. White has sacrificed the pawn and has these two nice pawns in the center, all right. But the counterplay is, I mean, it looks a bit fishy. It's not too simple to see exactly where it's going to come from. It's not obvious that he's forcefully taking the pawn back, and if you don't get material for it quickly, if you give Black a few moves, he's going to play bishop b7, he's going to play knight here, and he's going to play c5, and he's going to be doing just fine, and he will still have the extra pawn. So you do need to be a bit precise, especially as White here. And Magnus found the almost only good move here, e5. And what it does is that it keeps Black's pieces under check. It reopens this bishop. A pawn on e5 is like a wedge in the position, and so ideas of attacking Black's king side are always something that you need to look out for here. So Nepo put the bishop on b7 to counteract the strong bishop on g2. Magnus took on f6, the bishop took back, and then Magnus played knight e4, hitting that bishop and then daring you. Now I and probably a lot of you would probably just think about taking this pawn here on d4, and it's a huge mistake, and Black is completely lost after the sequence takes, and then knight g5. And that's the thing with the Catalan, because you get such good pieces and you force Black into such a passive position, it's very easy for you to just switch and start attacking the king, because you have active pieces. It's not easy, it's not difficult for you to switch your focus and attack the king, whereas on the other side it's very difficult for Black to defend the king. So something like this is actually just completely winning. You're attacking e6 and you're attacking h7, and Black actually can't defend both, so you get an overwhelming attack. You can also take here, and this guy is pinned, and all your pieces are doing fine, and Black pretty much has just one good piece, and it's not actually attacking anything. So after knight e4, of course, Nepo didn't fall for this. He played knight a6, and then Magnus played knight e5. Now this move seemed to be a bit imprecise. In fact, after the game, during an interview, he mentioned that he just blundered this move because he didn't see White's next move after he takes. Of course, bishop takes on e5, pawn takes, but Magnus missed this move, knight a to c5, and the knight is getting active and is challenging this knight on e4. Again, remember that White has already sacked the pawn, and so he needs to find counterplay. If he's just to exchange these knights off, then Black has completed development. Black has his extra pawn, and you're not winning the pawn back, because once you take, the bishop is defended, so he can just take back. So now White is actually a proper pawn down with very little counterplay. So I mean, you can go rook d1, but he will just put the knight back on d3, and Black is better. So White has to avoid something like this at all costs. And because Magnus missed this move, he had to put the knight here on d6, because he can't exchange that knight. So he played knight d6, but that forced him to sacrifice an exchange, because now Nepo plays knight b3, and yeah, the rook forks the knight forks the rook and the bishop, and because there are two knights attacking this guy, the rook is going to have to sacrifice itself for one of them. So Magnus played rook b1. Here actually the engine points out that since you are already forced to give up an exchange, it's better to just leave the rook on a1 and not waste that tempo, and then you can save your bishop with something like bishop e3, so that after he takes on here, you just take back there. But the way Magnus did it, he played rook b1, and then the knight took on c1, then the rook moved again to take, so he kind of wasted a move over there. The knight took back, and the rook took back, and now Magnus is down a pawn and an exchange. So Nepo is doing quite well, but it's still not so simple. First of all, this knight on d6 is very strong. It's almost worth a rook. And this bishop here on b7 hasn't really managed to solve its problems just yet. You can't easily play c5 because of the problems with this pawn on b5. The pawn on b5 will hang. And if you had time, what we'd love to do is play a6 and then c5, but I just don't have enough time to do that. So first off, he played rook a b8 to defend the bishop and also give the bishop space to slide back, so that it's no longer attacked by this knight. And then Magnus played rook d1, eyeing the queen, threatening some tactics like knight b5 was revealed. So Nepo played bishop a8, and actually now Magnus could play knight takes on b5 with a revealed attack on the queen. But after, say, queen, I don't know, I guess queen here is fine, queen b7. Now the knight has to move, right? And then Nepo also wins material back and probably forces an exchange. So Magnus has already given up an exchange, so he doesn't want queens to come off. So he avoided this move, and after bishop a8, he went for a very interesting bishop e4. Again, because you have better pieces in the Catalan, it's very easy for you to switch and attack black skin. In this position, it might not be obvious to you that black skin deserves to be attacked, but after the move bishop e4, it's actually very, very easy to fall into a checkmating attack. We can look at an example. If you play an innocuous looking move, like say there's a pawn hanging, so you decide to take the pawn, bishop takes a4, all of a sudden black is completely lost because bishop takes a7 just wins the game. And the king has to take back, and after queen h5 check, king g8, rook d4. With the threat of playing rook h4 and checkmating, you realize that you actually have little to no defense. Because this knight on d6 is so strong and takes the f7 square away from your king, there's no way to actually escape. So you'd have to play something like queen e7, and after rook h4, you actually have to give up your queen for the rook just to survive. So that was the kind of threat behind the move bishop e4. And so here the engine's best move was for Nepo to go g6, blunt the bishop, stop any of such ideas. And here Nepo was supposed to be doing better according to the engine, about a pawns with minus 1.3 was the evaluation here. But yeah, it's not too easy to play. Again, your queen side is still a bit of a mess with this bishop and these pawns. And so Nepo decided to go for something a little safer with less chances of actually losing. So here he played c3, and the idea is that you don't have time to go for the sequence we just looked at. Right now, you can't go bishop h7 anymore because after takes here, and rook d4, you don't have enough time because of c2. And yeah, I mean, you do this, but then black queens, and then you die, basically. You get mated here. So after c3, you have to sort of change plans. So Magnus decided to play queen c2, and he's going to pick up the pawn comfortably, but now he's threatening to take on h7 again. So here Nepo went g6, and then the b pawn took on c3. Then he took the pawn on a4 as well, opening up his b file rook, and then again Magnus took on a4 with the queen. And with these two exchanges, Nepo has transformed the position just a little bit. Now his king is a lot safer. It's difficult to imagine the king coming under any sort of direct trouble. And what that means is that although Magnus is still down an exchange and the pawn, he doesn't have more than counterplay, right? Previously he still had some pressure, but here it's not too difficult to neutralize the activity of white pieces. So the rook came here. Magnus played rook a1, attacking the a pawn. Nepo played c5, taking the opportunity to exchange off these two guys. So Magnus played queen c4. Nepo took on e4. One of white's two strong pieces is now gone. The knight took back. King went to h8. The knight came back to d6. Rook b6. The queen took the extra pawn on c5. And then rook h2 b8. And now the position is looking quite equal again. Again, still although Magnus is still down an exchange, again the rook on d6 is super strong. It's basically worth a rook. So material wise, you can count this as a rook. Queen and two rooks versus queen and two rooks. So there's that dynamic equality going on. Nepo played king, Magnus played king g2. Nepo went a6, protecting the a pawn a little bit more. Then Magnus played this very curious move, king h3. It's a very computery neural network alpha 0 style move. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it does. I don't know whether king is looking to come up and say hi to the other king, but it's something that they do. It does get the king out of a lot of checks along this diagonal, may be relevant during some tactics that come along later on in the game. And here Nepo went rook to c6, attacking the queen. The queen came to d4. Black's king came to g8. And Nepo played c4. And I realized just how strong this knight is. It stops you from making any progress down the c file. It's blocking the d file. And yeah, I mean, Black can't actually do anything with his rooks, although he has them. So he played queen c7. Magnus played queen g4. And this is the move another move that he criticized a bit after the game. Because he didn't really have to allow, because this knight on d6 is so strong, eventually Black is going to have to sacrifice one of his rooks for it, right? But currently, because the queen supports that square, you can't really sack, because the pawn that will land on that square will also be defended. So if Magnus had just waited around, strengthened his position a little, maybe he could have been a bit more annoying to Black. But once he played queen g4, yeah, Black just took the opportunity and snapped took on d6. And here it was clear that the position was going to end in a draw. It should be said though that this was on move 37, so they were 3 moves away from time control. Magnus had, I think, just about 3 or so minutes left, and that may have explained the reason why he decided to go for this simplification. So here he played c5, the queen took, then he took on e6 with check. King g7 was played, then he snap took the pawn on the a file, but then Nepo found a move, rook f8, and now you can't stop queen f5, check, exchanging queens. And once the queens come off, f4, exactly that happens. Once the queens come off, this is the theoretical endgame. Rook endgame with 3 on 2, it's a draw. I mean, no one actually loses this in Grandmaster level play. So here they both played a bit on, shuffled a bit, pretended like they didn't both know was going to end in a draw. And then after a few moves, they played on for a bit. Yeah, here they agreed to the draw. I mean, it's a threefold repetition if you don't want to draw. So yeah, this was game 2. Again, another very interesting game. I mean, clearly, like we expected, both showed up ready to fight. Neither of them is really looking to play super solid or, you know, draw their way through the classical portion at least. So that's the good news, that we can look forward to having an exciting match. We have learned a few things as well. With regards to Magnus's prep, I wouldn't be surprised if he's prepared a little bit of everything. He likes doing that. So although he has started with this, it's very possible that in his next white game he goes for something else. But in general, there is a trend that is starting to appear, which is that he's very happy to sacrifice pawns in the opening for activity and for some play, which in general suggests that, I mean, he's been using these neural networks for preparation. They really like doing stuff like that, because he's done this in both games, right? Yesterday's game sacrificed the pawn, today he did the same, even sacrificed an exchange as well for the play. But both times Nepo has proven to be up to the task, and although he's been sort of out prepared in both games, he's done very well, and he kept his nerve and didn't actually make any serious mistakes in either game, and actually had his chances in both games as well. So so far he's proven that he can also play some chess and he can prove to be quite a challenge for Magnus, even if he doesn't get his openings on the board. So yeah, it's looking to be an exciting match. We look forward to seeing what game 3 will bring tomorrow. Speaking of which, let me know in the comments what you think will happen tomorrow. Tomorrow, Nepo has white once again. What opening do you think they will play? Will he repeat 1e4? Will Magnus repeat the marshal? Will he go for another anti-marshal? Will he try h4? Will he try something else? And what do you think the result of the game will be? Catch you later. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment, drop a like. Happy chessing, and I'll see you later.